What happens when the biggest band on the planet actually clashes? We always see the bright smiles, flawless choreography, and that unbreakable brotherhood on screen, but behind closed doors, the insane pressure cooker of fame, exhaustion, and ambition almost tore them apart. Have you ever wondered what really goes down when 7 completely different personalities are forced to survive together? Who snapped first? Which argument almost ended it all? Get ready, because these fights changed everything.
Number 7. Jin, the ticking clock, a backstage eruption. Picture this. It is 2017, the absolute boiling point of BTS's highly explosive career during the grueling, globe-trotting Wings tour, where the stakes were astronomically high, the international arenas were terrifyingly massive, and the physical exhaustion was completely tearing them apart behind the blinding, glamorous stage lights. You might think the biggest threats to a massive band's survival are giant public scandals, greedy management, or bitter financial disputes, but the cold, harsh truth is that the most dangerous poison is pure, unadulterated exhaustion mixed with a desperate, suffocating need to be absolutely perfect. And nobody felt this intense, crushing weight more than the eldest member, Kim Sek-jin. Jin always carried the invisible, incredibly heavy burden of being the oldest brother, the designated Hyung, who had to constantly maintain the bright mood, deliver the goofy dad jokes, occasionally cook the meals, and completely swallow his own dark struggles, so the younger members wouldn't ever have to worry about him. But on this specific fateful day, literally just 10 agonizing minutes before they had to go out and face tens of thousands of screaming fans, the pressure cooker finally exploded in a backstage dressing room that suddenly felt much smaller, colder, and exponentially more suffocating than a concrete prison cell. The unbearable tension started over something seemingly insignificant, a mere matter of seconds and exact footsteps in the complex, sweeping choreography for Spring Day, a deeply emotional track that is ironically about missing your friends, forgiving each other, and staying together against all odds. Yet it was the very thing aggressively tearing them apart in that volatile moment. Taehyung, who is deeply, almost obsessively invested in the flawless perfection of their live performance and visual storytelling, sharply pointed out that Jin needed to move much faster from his stage position so that the entire intricate formation wouldn't fall completely apart. From a purely technical and performance standpoint, it was a completely valid and necessary critique, but it was delivered in a high-stress moment of extreme anxiety, with adrenaline violently pumping through their veins and the ticking clock echoing in their ears. But to truly grasp the monumental gravity of this clash, you have to profoundly understand Jin's harsh reality here. He is not naturally a gifted dancer. He didn't start with the innate rhythmic instincts of the others, meaning he had to work 10, maybe 20 times harder behind closed doors just to blend in with natural-born prodigies like Jimin and Jhope. His muscles were constantly aching, his lungs were burning on a daily basis, and he was already pushing his physical and mental limits to the absolute brink just to keep his head above water and not be a burden. So when he heard that sharp critique from a younger member right before showtime, it didn't just sound like a helpful stage note, it felt like a direct, ungrateful attack on his grueling, unseen efforts and literal blood-sweat sacrifices, prompting him to snap back aggressively, his voice raised in a chaotic mixture of defensive anger and heartbreaking, bone-deep exhaustion, explicitly and loudly stating that he was already running as fast as his legs could possibly carry him, and that he mathematically and physically could not move any faster than he already was. The argument quickly escalated out of control. The tone drastically shifted from a professional, polite discussion to a raw, highly emotional clash of bruised egos and hidden pain, with V feeling deeply disrespected by Jin's highly defensive reaction, and Jin feeling completely unappreciated, overly scrutinized, and pushed into a dark corner by a younger brother he had practically helped raise from his awkward teenage years. The atmosphere in that claustrophobic, painfully quiet quiet dressing room plummeted to freezing temperatures, the other members paralyzed in a terrifying state of shock and discomfort, helplessly watching two foundational pillars of their found family crumble right before curtain call. It got so intensely hostile that RM, forced to put on the heavy, unforgiving crown of leadership, had to violently cut through the toxic noise, reminding them with chilling, uncharacteristic sternness that they were BTS, that thousands of fans were waiting for them outside, and that they had strictly no choice but to bury their bleeding egos right then and there to put on a legendary show. Imagine the sheer, agonizing mental fortitude it took for Jin to aggressively swallow that massive, choking lump of anger, betrayal, and profound sadness in his throat, forcibly plaster on a flawless, glowing smile, rise up on that mechanical stage elevator, and sing Spring Day with angelic vocals, while looking directly into the eyes of the person he just screamed at, all while thousands of high-definition cameras recorded their every single flinch and micro-expression. The performance was flawlessly professional to the naked eye, but the emotional undercurrent on that stage was incredibly volatile, a ticking bomb just waiting to completely detonate the exact second they stepped off the stage and away from the blinding spotlights. And detonate it absolutely did, but miraculously not in the destructive, bridge-burning way you might expect from a typical global boy band that eventually violently breaks up over petty, unresolved feuds. Instead, this explosive confrontation became the single most defining turning point for Jin and the entire group's internal communication dynamic. Back at the hotel, completely stripped of the heavy stage makeup, the flashy costumes, and the roaring, deafening crowds, the seven of them sat together in a tight circle, the air incredibly heavy with unspoken apologies, lingering defensive walls, and an overwhelming sense of dread. It was in this incredibly vulnerable space that Jin did something extraordinarily brave, something that completely changed the trajectory of their brotherhood forever. Instead of aggressively pulling rank as the eldest in a strict hierarchical Korean culture, instead of doubling down on his fiery anger, he completely shattered his own protective armor, openly and tearfully confessing his deep-seated, paralyzing insecurities about his dancing abilities, his constant haunting fear of holding the team back, and the monumental, agonizing effort it took for him just to survive their grueling daily routines. He bravely admitted that his fierce pride was merely a fragile defense mechanism, a desperate shield to protect his deeply bruised confidence, and seeing his younger brother passionately challenge him triggered that deep, dark fear of inadequacy he tried so desperately hard to hide from the world. This raw, unfiltered, and profoundly honest vulnerability completely disarmed Taehyung, who immediately broke down in uncontrollable tears, suddenly realizing the immense, silent, agonizing weight his young had been carrying all along without complaining, and he apologized profusely for letting his blind ambition and stage perfectionism blind him to his silent physical and emotional pain. This wasn't just a trivial fight about choreography timing or stage positioning, it was a profound, soul-bearing collision that fundamentally rewired exactly how BTS functioned as a cohesive unit, proving to themselves that true brotherhood isn't about pretending everything is perfect and never fighting, but about having the sheer courage to bleed your deepest insecurities dry in front of each other, and finding a compassionate way to heal the open wound together. Every single time you watch the Wings Tour documentary now, knowing the sheer amount of tears and frustration that preceded that flawless performance, it completely changes how you view their smiles on stage, making you realize that their legendary teamwork wasn't magically handed to them by the universe. It was brutally forged in the roaring fires of intense stress, clashing personalities, and the desperate, unwavering desire to understand each other even when it hurt terribly.
Number 6. Jimin, the Great Dumpling War, a friendship almost severed. Picture this. It is the incredibly stressful, sleep-deprived era of their early 20s, a time when BTS was transitioning from struggling underdogs to global phenomenons, and the suffocating pressure to flawlessly deliver every single choreography move was pushing their fragile nervous systems to the absolute breaking point.
You might logically think that the most devastating arguments within a world-class music group revolve around massive creative differences, unequal line distributions, or viciously greedy financial disputes. But the shocking, hilarious, yet deeply emotional reality is that one of the most explosive, relationship-altering fights in BTS history was actually over a simple, unassuming plate of dumplings. Yes, you heard that right. Completely ordinary pork dumplings almost severed the sacred bond between two inseparable best friends. Enter Jimin, the fiercely dedicated, terrifyingly perfectionist lead dancer whose relentless, punishing work ethic often meant sacrificing his own basic human needs, including food and sleep, just to ensure the team's performance was nothing short of absolute perfection. On this particularly grueling, sweat-drenched afternoon inside their claustrophobic dance studio, the boys were physically running on agonizingly empty fumes, their muscles screaming in agony as they relentlessly drilled their complex routines for an impending high-stakes comeback that would ultimately dictate their future success or absolute failure. Out of nowhere, Taehyung, who was absolutely starving, completely drained of physical energy, and simultaneously filming a highly stressful historical K-drama outside of their regular group activities, eagerly suggested that they pause their brutal punishment just for a few minutes to eat a steaming plate of mandu that had just been delivered, a seemingly innocent and perfectly reasonable request from a desperately hungry young man trying to survive the day. But to Jimin, whose brain was operating in strict, uncompromising survival mode, breaking the sacred flow of their intensive practice for a quick snack was an unforgivable disruption, a blatant sign of losing vital focus when they needed it the absolute most. Jimin, firmly, with a sharp edge of authority and intense irritation in his exhausted voice, insisted that they finish the grueling dance practice first and eat the dumplings later as a collective reward, fiercely believing that ironclad discipline must completely override temporary physical discomfort in order to reach the absolute pinnacle of their craft. This stark, fundamental clash of priorities instantly ignited a massive, fiery powder keg of suppressed stress, sheer exhaustion, and the profound, unspoken anxieties of two intensely passionate young men trying desperately to prove their worth in a ruthlessly cutthroat entertainment industry. The argument rapidly mutated from a petty disagreement over food into a full-blown, highly volatile screaming match, their voices echoing aggressively off the mirror-lined walls of the studio as years of unspoken frustrations, contrasting personalities, and differing coping mechanisms violently collided in real time. Taehyung felt entirely invalidated, seeing Jimin's strictness as an unfeeling, robotic lack of empathy for his genuine physical exhaustion and punishing outside acting schedules, while Jimin felt utterly disrespected, interpreting Taehyung's desire to eat as a careless, lazy disregard for the team's collective, monumental effort and their shared, desperately ambitious dreams. The situation escalated so intensely and became so uncomfortably toxic that the other members, absolutely paralyzed by the sudden ferocious hostility radiating between the group's legendary 95Z soulmates, had to physically intervene, ultimately leading to the two best friends being banished outside the practice room by the other older members to resolve their fiery dispute like mature adults. But instead of immediately apologizing, they stubbornly dug their heels deep into the icy ground of their wounded pride, wrapping themselves in a suffocating, impenetrable blanket of heavy silence that lasted for days, creating a deeply agonizing Cold War that severely disrupted the harmonious, light-hearted ecosystem of the entire group. Imagine the sheer, excruciating awkwardness of having to perfectly synchronize intricate, high-speed dance moves, harmonize angelic vocals in the tiny recording booth, and playfully smile for dozens of glaring reality show cameras while actively refusing to even make brief, fleeting eye contact with your absolute best friend in the entire world.
It was a miserable, heart-wrenching period of stubborn pride and deeply hurt feelings, but it was also a desperately needed, profound catalyst for crucial emotional growth, forcing both young men to take a long, harsh look in the mirror and deeply reevaluate exactly how they communicated their affection and fundamental respect for one another under immense psychological pressure. The glorious, much-needed breakthrough finally happened not in a cold, formal company meeting room, but late at night in a quiet, dimly lit park, fueled by raw emotions, the gentle but firm encouragement of their wise leader RM, a few drinks, and the overwhelming, undeniable realization that their precious brotherhood was infinitely more valuable than their fragile, bruised egos. Jimin, completely shedding his tough perfectionist armor, openly and vulnerably confessed that his intense strictness didn't come from a place of malice, arrogance, or a desire for superiority, but from a deeply rooted, terrifying anxiety of failing the group, of not being fundamentally good enough to stand beside them, and that his desperate need for absolute control in the practice room was just a flawed, desperate shield against the crushing, unimaginable pressure of their skyrocketing international fame. Hearing this raw, bleeding confession completely shattered Taehyung's defensive walls, allowing him to finally understand the profound, silent emotional agony behind Jimin's relentless, punishing drive, and the two exhausted boys wept openly in the empty park, completely forgiving each other and forging an entirely new, deeply empathetic foundation for their friendship that could withstand absolutely any violent storm. This seemingly ridiculous dumpling incident completely revolutionized Jimin's perspective on teamwork, true empathy, and personal relations, teaching him the invaluable, life-altering lesson that true discipline isn't about ruthlessly punishing yourself and your teammates until you break, but about finding a compassionate, highly flexible balance between relentless ambition and basic, forgiving human empathy. It profoundly forced him to accept that every single member processes immense stress and physical exhaustion completely differently, and that rigidly imposing his own brutal coping mechanisms onto his brothers was a highly toxic recipe for ultimate disaster and inevitable heartbreak. The stunning, deeply moving aftermath of this legendary clash eventually birthed the beautiful, deeply emotional subunit song Friends, a deeply personal, musical masterpiece where they permanently immortalized the infamous dumpling fight in the lyrics, proudly wearing their past conflicts and tearful misunderstandings as glorious badges of honor and unshakable proof of their tested, hardened, and absolutely unbreakable bond. Every single time Jimin now smiles warmly at Taehyung on stage or gently comforts another member who makes a tiny choreography mistake, you are witnessing the beautiful, hard-earned evolution of a young man who bravely learned to transform his tough, perfectionist armor into gentle, unwavering support, proving definitively to the entire world that the most profound soulmate connections aren't the fake, polished ones that never ever fight, but the authentic ones that fight violently, bleed openly, confront their darkest internal insecurities, and consciously choose to stitch each other's emotional wounds back together, making them infinitely stronger, wiser, and incredibly more united than they ever were before. Number 5. Jhope, the infamous banana clash, a bitter bite of brotherhood. Picture this. It is the incredibly harsh, profoundly uncertain, and painfully broke early days of BTS, long before the private jets, the custom luxury Dior outfits, the shiny black cards, and the sold-out global stadium tours that would eventually define their untouchable, record-breaking musical empire. Back when they were just 7 desperate, severely sleep-deprived teenagers crammed like absolute sardines into a single, aggressively suffocating, famously tiny one-room dormitory in Nonhyandong. You have to genuinely understand the stark, wildly unglamorous reality of their absolute rock-bottom beginnings to fully grasp the extreme emotional weight of what happened next. They were practically surviving on cheap, sodium-packed convenience store ramen, heavily shared plates of affordable fried rice, and sheer blind faith. meaning that high-quality, fresh food was essentially treated like rare, highly coveted gold in their constantly hungry, intensely exhausting household. Enter Jhope, the universally beloved, eternally optimistic sunshine of the group, the vital emotional pillar and incredibly demanding dance leader, who famously gave up his own bed for the younger members, constantly shared every single meager financial and physical resource he had, and actively took on the severely exhausting role of the ever-smiling mood maker, just to keep the team's fragile spirits from completely shattering under the crushing, terrifying weight of their uncertain debut. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, enter Jungkook, the incredibly gifted golden Maknae. But at that specific, highly vulnerable time in their history, he was literally just a terrified, highly sensitive 15-year-old child who had bravely left his entire family, his comfortable home, and his childhood friends completely behind in Busan to chase an impossible, seemingly foolish dream in the terrifying, fast-paced, cutthroat city of Seoul. When you are that shockingly young, surrounded by older, intimidating guys, completely stripped of your familiar support system, and actively lacking anything that belongs solely and completely to you, you naturally develop a fierce, almost primal defensiveness over the very few tiny, insignificant possessions you can actually call your own. The explosive catalyst for this legendary, fundamentally relationship-altering fight wasn't a massive public scandal, a violent physical brawl, or a bitter greed-fueled dispute over money. It was quite literally a simple, incredibly ordinary bundle of bananas that had been lovingly gifted specifically to Jungkook by an early, dedicated fan who just wanted to make sure the youngest member was eating well. In the fiercely communal, highly interdependent ecosystem of their cramped dorm, the unspoken, sacred rule was that absolutely everything was automatically shared, from overly stretched t-shirts and unmatched, worn-out socks to whatever precious scraps of decent food managed to enter their tiny, heavily clustered kitchen. So when Jhope casually, without a single second thought or ounce of malice, grabbed a banana from the fan-gifted fruit basket and started happily eating it after an agonizing dance practice, he completely expected it to be just another normal, brotherly moment of sharing to refuel his completely drained body. But for teenage Jungkook, who was heavily operating under an intense, fear-driven scarcity mindset and desperately craving just one single isolated thing in his incredibly chaotic life that didn't have to be instantly divided 7 ways, seeing his precious personal fan gift being casually consumed triggered a sudden, wildly uncharacteristic wave of youthful possessiveness, overwhelming stress, and fierce territorial frustration. Jungkook, completely forgetting his strict Korean manners and the heavy mandatory cultural respect traditionally owed to an older Hyung, sharply and defensively snapped at Jhope, demanding that he immediately stop eating it and loudly declaring that the fruit was his exclusive personal property, specifically given to him and completely off limits for the entire group to scavenge like hungry wolves. Jhope froze instantly, the half-eaten banana hovering awkwardly in midair, his bright, glowing signature smile instantly dissolving into a dark mask of pure, unadulterated shock, deeply profound emotional hurt, and then, completely unexpectedly, blazing, white-hot, fiery anger. To Jhope, who had literally sacrificed his own comfort, his own portions of food, and his own sanity countless times to painstakingly nurture, train, and aggressively protect this exact younger brother, Jungkook's sudden, highly aggressive stinginess over a cheap piece of fruit didn't just feel incredibly disrespectful. It felt like a massive, violent, deeply personal slap directly to the face, a highly painful betrayal of the sacred, unconditional blood-brother bond he thought they had spent years bleeding and sweating to build from the ground up.
in a legendary, highly dramatic flash of blinding fury that the entire group still fiercely and hilariously debates on television to this very day. Jhope, violently trembling with absolute disbelief and a deeply bruised heart, violently hurled the half-eaten banana violently at Jungkook, screaming in a deeply hurt, utterly defeated tone that if he was going to be that incredibly petty, horribly selfish, and totally ungrateful over a cheap piece of fruit, he could just eat the entire thing all by himself. The tiny room instantly plunged into a thick, suffocating, utterly terrifying silence, the heavy, wet thud of the discarded banana echoing like a massive gunshot against the peeling wallpaper of the dorm, leaving a fiercely proud, heartbroken older brother storming out in pure disgust, and a deeply shocked, heavily regretting teenager standing perfectly still, suddenly and painfully realizing the massive, devastating magnitude of his childish, greedy mistake. This wasn't just a funny, trivial argument over a post-practice snack. It was a highly emotional, severely painful collision of intense, grinding poverty, extreme physical hunger, desperate youth, and the absolute fragile limits of human patience, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that even the most incredibly generous, angelic people have a definitive breaking point when they feel fundamentally unappreciated, emotionally drained, and deeply taken for granted by the people they love the absolute most. But the true breathtaking magic of BTS's legendary world-conquering Brotherhood is exactly how they handle the agonizing, highly uncomfortable aftermath of the explosion. Instead of letting this deeply bitter, fiercely embarrassing moment permanently ruin their dynamic or slowly poison their daily interactions, it miraculously forced a massive, incredibly healthy psychological shift in the entire group's internal culture. The very next day, completely swallowed by overwhelming guilt and intensely realizing how terribly he had wounded the very young who loved and protected him the absolute most, Jungkook completely dropped his childish defensive walls, swallowed his immense pride, and offered a deep, incredibly sincere, tearful apology, swearing to completely eradicate his selfish habits and actively choosing from that day forward to wholeheartedly embrace the beautiful, highly rewarding concept of absolute, unconditional sharing. This incredibly stupid, hilariously tragic banana incident effectively killed the selfish, highly defensive teenage version of Jungkook and completely birthed the fiercely generous, endlessly giving, fiercely loyal golden Maknae we all profoundly know and deeply adore today. A phenomenally wealthy man who now famously insists on paying for massive, highly expensive luxury dinners for all his older brothers without a single moment of hesitation.
Number 4. Suga, the studio meltdown, a collision of musical titans. Picture this. It is the incredibly dark, painfully uncertain, and heavily suffocating transition period just before the explosive, massive global success of The Most Beautiful Moment in Life, an agonizing era where BTS was precariously balancing on the incredibly sharp, unforgiving edge of a knife, actively facing the terrifying, undeniable reality that if their very next album wasn't a massive, record-breaking hit, their entire, tiny, heavily indebted company could violently collapse into permanent bankruptcy, and their desperately chased, blood-soaked dreams would instantly turn to absolute ash. You must deeply, profoundly understand the astronomical, mind-breaking psychological weight that was aggressively crushing the creative backbone of the group during this specific, highly volatile timeline, a pressure so intensely physical that it literally robbed them of their ability to sleep, eat, or breathe normally for months on end. Enter Suga, the notoriously quiet, fiercely independent, and profoundly intense musical genius of the group, a fiercely proud young man who had literally starved on the unforgiving, freezing streets of Daegu, tragically shattered his shoulder in a horrific delivery accident just to desperately pay his basic school tuition, and sold his deeply personal, incredibly raw underground beats for mere insulting pennies,
all driven entirely by a burning, obsessive, almost terrifying desire to prove his countless wealthy, arrogant doubters entirely wrong. For Suga, music was absolutely never just a shiny, manufactured commercial product to be casually consumed by screaming fans. It was his literal, beating heart, his raw, bleeding soul, his only true lifeline in a world that had constantly, violently rejected him, and his ultimate, desperate weapon against the suffocating, grinding poverty of his harsh youth. On the exact opposite side of this highly explosive, heavily pressurized creative equation stands RM, the incredibly brilliant, intensely philosophical, but astronomically burdened young leader who was originally handpicked by the company to be the foundational, unbreakable pillar of the entire group, constantly crushed under the monumental, isolating responsibility of somehow bridging the terrifying, seemingly impossible gaping chasm between their authentic, gritty underground hip-hop credibility and the highly manufactured, vibrantly glittery, ruthlessly demanding world of mainstream K-pop. Inside their tiny, notoriously windowless, severely unventilated, and completely claustrophobic production studio, famously known as the Genius Lab, the stale air was impossibly thick with the toxic, blinding fumes of empty energy drink cans, desperately consumed stale coffee, and the pure, unadulterated stench of sheer, terrifying desperation as the two musical titans worked violently through the night for the fourth consecutive day in a row. The explosive, relationship-altering catalyst for this legendary, incredibly volatile clash wasn't a petty, childish argument over food, dorm chores, or shared clothing, but a deeply profound, fiercely passionate, and fundamentally terrifying disagreement over the exact creative direction, authentic lyrical messaging, and absolute sonic identity of the very tracks that held the fragile, uncertain fate of all 7 members in their complex digital wavelengths. Suga, whose completely exhausted physical body was practically running entirely on dangerous levels of toxic adrenaline and severely unresolved, deeply rooted childhood trauma, fiercely and aggressively advocated for a much darker, incredibly raw and unapologetically aggressive sound that strictly stayed incredibly true to their rebellious, anti-establishment hip-hop roots, fiercely refusing to violently compromise his bleeding artistic integrity for the sake of cheap, easily digestible public radio play. However, RM, carrying the massive, incredibly heavy, and terrifyingly lonely burden of the entire group's actual, literal financial survival on his tired, slumped shoulders, desperately argued with intense, pleading logic that they absolutely needed to evolve, to slightly soften their aggressive edges, and to create something far more deeply melodic, emotionally vulnerable, and universally accessible if they ever wanted to finally break out of their suffocating underdog status and actually save their sinking company from total, unavoidable annihilation. The argument, initially starting as a tense, exhausted debate over a single snare drum sample and a specific lyrical cadence, violently and unexpectedly mutated into a full-blown, incredibly hostile, deafeningly loud screaming match that aggressively shook the thin, soundproofed walls of the tiny studio, with both intensely proud, incredibly stubborn underground rappers aggressively hurling their deeply held frustrations, their paralyzing, unspeakable anxieties, and their fiercely bruised, bleeding egos directly into each other's exhausted, heavily shadowed faces. Suga, fiercely triggered by the terrifying, haunting prospect of essentially selling out and violently betraying the very underground culture that had originally saved his life, completely snapped under the crushing, unimaginable pressure, aggressively violently sweeping massive stacks of heavily scribbled lyric papers, empty cups, and heavy recording equipment violently off the desk in a blinding, explosive fit of pure, unadulterated creative rage
rage and profound bone-deep physical exhaustion. He screamed with raw, vocal cord-tearing intensity that nobody in the entire company genuinely understood the massive, agonizing sacrifices he had made to simply stay alive, while RM, equally pushed far beyond the absolute breaking point of human sanity and desperate emotional endurance, fiercely roared back with devastating, heartbreaking volume, completely shattering his usual calm, diplomatic, tightly controlled leader persona, explicitly and aggressively detailing the terrifying, sleepless nightmares he constantly endured, knowing that if he made one single microscopic misstep in their musical direction, he would be entirely responsible for violently destroying the innocent dreams of the 5 other younger boys who blindly trusted him with their entire lives. The tiny, suffocating room instantly plunged into an incredibly heavy, violently ringing, utterly terrifying silence, the chaotic, scattered debris of their violent, explosive outburst heavily littering the cold studio floor, like the tragic, devastating aftermath of a massive, deadly war zone, leaving 2 of the most incredibly brilliant, deeply passionate minds in the entire Korean music industry, standing violently chest to chest, completely breathless, visibly shaking with highly weaponized adrenaline, and staring directly into the deeply terrified, incredibly vulnerable, tear-filled eyes of the only other human being on the entire planet who actually truly understood the exact, identical, massive creative burden they were both carrying. This intensely terrifying, highly emotional, and brutally raw confrontation could have easily, permanently, and violently shattered the very core of BTS, permanently dividing the crucial rap line and completely destroying their internal creative engine forever. But instead, it became the single most profound, incredibly beautiful, and completely legendary turning point in their entire massive musical evolution.
Number 3. V's Hwoarang Meltdown, a confrontation of hidden tears. Picture this. It is the incredibly demanding, physically devastating, and highly chaotic year of 2016, an era where BTS was aggressively transitioning from rising stars into undisputed global heavyweights, with the incredibly complex, insanely intricate, and highly exhausting masterpiece that was the blood, sweat, and tears era. While the entire group was already being pushed to the absolute terrifying limits of human physical endurance with relentless, bone-breaking choreography practices and an insanely packed non-stop global promotional schedule, there was one specific member who was silently carrying an entirely different, uniquely terrifying, and incredibly isolating psychological burden that almost completely broke him. Enter V, widely known as Taehyung, the fiercely creative, incredibly expressive, and profoundly sensitive artistic soul of the group, a young man who always naturally wore his heart completely on his sleeve and brightly infected everyone around him with his beautifully eccentric, carefree energy. But during this extremely critical juncture in their skyrocketing career, Taehyung was boldly chosen to be the very first member of BTS to officially debut as a professional actor in the highly anticipated, intensely scrutinized historical K-drama Hwoarang, stepping completely alone into a ruthless, cutthroat acting industry where traditional actors frequently looked down upon idol-turned actors with intense, glaring skepticism and harsh, unforgiving judgment. You have to genuinely, profoundly understand the astronomical, mind-breaking terror that suddenly engulfed this young man. He wasn't just acting for his own personal ambition, he felt the incredibly heavy, suffocating weight of the entire BTS brand on his solitary, trembling shoulders, completely terrified that if he made one single amateur mistake, forgot one crucial line, or delivered a highly criticized performance, the vicious media would mercilessly tear him apart and completely ruin the pristine, hard-earned reputation of his 6 deeply beloved brothers.
This intense, paralyzing fear of public failure completely hijacked his usually bright personality, plunging him into a dark, suffocating, and deeply isolating cycle of extreme, sleep-deprived perfectionism, where he would literally spend his entire nights agonizing over complex drama scripts in the dark, desperately practicing his lines until his vocal cords were completely raw, and then immediately rushing straight into the grueling, sweat-drenched BTS dance practices without a single minute of actual restorative sleep. As the immense, crushing pressure heavily compounded week after agonizing week, Taehyung began to drastically change, slowly but surely withdrawing completely into a dark, impenetrable emotional shell, completely shutting out the very members who were his absolute lifelines, offering only short, highly defensive, and sharply irritable responses whenever his deeply concerned brothers gently tried to check on his rapidly deteriorating mental state. The highly explosive catalyst for this incredibly emotional, tear-soaked confrontation wasn't a loud, violent screaming match over choreography or a bitter, petty dispute over shared dorm resources, but rather a profoundly tense, deeply agonizing intervention initiated by the group who could no longer stand by and helplessly watch their precious younger brother slowly drown in his own silent, suffocating sea of extreme anxiety. Inside their dimly lit, incredibly quiet hotel room after yet another massive, violently exhausting stadium performance, the remaining 6 members completely cornered Taehyung, their intentions rooted purely in deep, desperate love, but their collective, highly focused approach instantly triggered Taehyung's massively overwhelmed, heavily bruised, and extremely fragile emotional defenses. Feeling completely cornered, entirely misunderstood, and fiercely judged by the only people in the world he actually trusted, Taehyung violently snapped, his voice trembling with a chaotic, heartbreaking mixture of intense defensive anger and profound, bone-deep exhaustion as he loudly and passionately argued that none of them could possibly understand the terrifying, unique, and massively isolating pressure of standing completely alone on a drama set filled with legendary veteran actors, while simultaneously trying desperately not to become a heavy, burdensome anchor dragging the entire musical group down. The atmosphere in that claustrophobic room became incredibly thick, intensely volatile, and highly emotional, with Taehyung fiercely pushing them away, aggressively insisting that he had to fix his own glaring flaws completely by himself, deeply terrified that exposing his raw, bleeding vulnerabilities and terrifying acting insecurities would only burden his incredibly overworked brothers even more than he already had. But this was the exact incredibly crucial moment where the legendary, profoundly beautiful empathy of BTS completely shattered the dark, toxic illusion of solitary suffering, as Jimin, Taehyung's designated soulmate and fearlessly loyal best friend, completely refused to back down or accept this incredibly stubborn, self-destructive isolation. Stepping directly into Taehyung's fiery, defensive personal space, completely ignoring the sharp, angry rejection, Jimin delivered a deeply profound, incredibly raw, and absolute perspective-shattering truth that immediately brought the entire heated confrontation to a grinding, tearful halt, stating with intense, unwavering sincerity that while they might not completely understand the exact technical pressures of acting on a historical drama set, they absolutely understood him, and that it was violently, incredibly arrogant of Taehyung to assume he had to carry the massive weight of the entire world completely alone when he had 6 fiercely loyal brothers who were literally willing to bleed for him. Hearing these profound, incredibly piercing words completely destroyed the massive, heavy, and exhausting emotional fortress Taehyung had spent months agonizingly building around his terrified heart, causing the overwhelming, violently suppressed floodgates of his immense stress, his paralyzing fear, and his profound loneliness to instantly, violently burst completely open. In one of the most incredibly raw, deeply vulnerable, and utterly heartbreaking moments in the entire history of the group, Taehyung heavily collapsed into massive, uncontrollable, violently shaking sobs, completely shedding his fierce, defensive pride as he openly,
desperately confessed his haunting, terrifying nightmares of dragging the group down, his immense physical exhaustion, and his deep, agonizing fear of public failure. Instead of judging him, the entire group instantly rushed forward, tightly enveloping their violently weeping brother in a massive, deeply emotional, heavily tear-soaked group hug, fiercely promising him that they didn't care if his acting was absolutely terrible, they didn't care what the vicious public said, and they only cared about his genuine happiness and survival, officially establishing the incredibly profound, unbreakable promise that no member of BTS would ever be allowed to suffer entirely alone in the dark again. This deeply painful, highly emotional confrontation completely revolutionized Taehyung's entire psychological approach to immense pressure, fundamentally teaching him the incredibly beautiful, life-saving lesson that true strength isn't about silently enduring unimaginable agony until your mind completely breaks, but about having the sheer, breathtaking courage to look at your found family, openly admit that you are completely terrified, and allow them to help carry your incredibly heavy, burdensome cross. From that tearful, profoundly life-altering night onward, the dark, suffocating shadow of the Hwarang pressure completely lifted from his incredibly weary shoulders, permanently transforming Taehyung from an isolated, intensely anxious perfectionist into a deeply trusting, incredibly open, and fiercely communicative artist who now famously, constantly, and loudly declares his immense, unwavering love for his brothers, definitively proving to the entire world that the most incredibly powerful armor against the terrifying, crushing weight of global superstardom isn't fierce, unyielding independence, but absolute, unconditional, deeply unapologetic brotherhood.
Number 2. Jungkook, The Rainy Day Rebellion, A Tearful Runaway. Picture this. It is the highly tumultuous, emotionally volatile, and deeply confusing era of BTS's earliest years, a time when the incredibly heavy, massively suffocating pressure of sudden fame and relentless idol training was violently colliding with the awkward, incredibly fragile, and highly explosive reality of raw teenage puberty. You must deeply, profoundly understand the astronomical, mind-breaking psychological weight that was aggressively crushing the youngest member of the group, Jungkook, a wildly talented but incredibly terrified young boy who had bravely yet foolishly left his entire safe, familiar life in Busan to chase a massive, terrifying dream in the cold, unforgiving, and fast-paced metropolis of Seoul. Being crowned the absolute, undeniable golden maknae by the company and the millions of expectant fans wasn't just a highly flattering, beautiful compliment. It was a massive, terrifyingly heavy, and profoundly isolating crown of thorns, a constant, suffocating expectation that he had to be absolutely flawless at singing, dancing, rapping, and looking perfectly camera-ready at all times, without ever showing a single ounce of human weakness or exhaustion. But beneath that insanely polished, breathtakingly talented exterior was simply an overwhelmed, deeply exhausted teenager who was literally growing up under a massive, unforgiving microscope, constantly surrounded by 6 incredibly intense, fiercely driven older brothers who were aggressively acting as his teachers, his parents, his severe critics, and his only true friends. A highly complex, intensely pressurized dynamic that was an absolute ticking time bomb just waiting to violently detonate. The explosive catalyst for this legendary, fundamentally relationship-altering clash wasn't a massive public scandal, an unfair line distribution, or a deeply bitter, greed-fueled dispute over money, but a totally ordinary, incredibly petty, and intensely stubborn moment of pure, unadulterated teenage rebellion that aggressively pushed the incredibly patient, deeply loving boundaries of his older brothers to the absolute, violent breaking point. On this specific, heavily rain-soaked, incredibly gloomy day in Seoul, inside their claustrophobic, sweat-drenched practice room, the physically exhausted, heavily sleep-deprived group was intensely drilling their complex routines when Jungkook, entirely consumed by the overwhelming, frustrating hormones of his youth and a desperate, suffocating need to assert his own fiercely independent identity, began sharply, aggressively talking back to his older hungs with a fiercely disrespectful, uncharacteristically deeply stubborn attitude over an incredibly minor critique. Enter Jimin, the incredibly warm, deeply affectionate, but fiercely principled older brother who had practically raised Jungkook, constantly showering him with unconditional love, but also fiercely demanding absolute, unwavering respect for the foundational, unbreakable hierarchy of their sacred Korean cultural brotherhood. Seeing his precious younger brother fiercely disrespect the older members completely shattered Jimin's usual angelic patience, instantly triggering a massive, blinding flash of pure, highly protective, and deeply disappointed anger, causing Jimin to heavily confront Jungkook with intense, terrifying sternness, desperately trying to aggressively correct the highly toxic, rebellious behavior before it permanently ruined the incredibly fragile, beautiful ecosystem of their cohesive team. But Jungkook, completely blinded by his fiercely bruised, highly defensive teenage pride and the crushing massive exhaustion of his grueling, never-ending schedule, aggressively doubled down, fiercely refusing to back down, lower his voice, or offer even a simple apology, violently sparking a massive, deafeningly loud, and incredibly hostile screaming match that aggressively shook the very core of their deeply bonded brotherhood and left the other members standing in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Jimin, entirely pushed past the absolute, terrifying limits of his profound emotional endurance, finally snapped with a deeply heartbroken, incredibly furious intensity, aggressively screaming at Jungkook to just do whatever he absolutely wanted, loudly declaring that he was completely done trying to fiercely protect and gently guide a violently stubborn, deeply ungrateful kid, before aggressively storming right out of the practice room and leaving a heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly cold silence in his chaotic wake. Completely consumed by a massive, blinding wave of fiery teenage rage, intense, fiercely defensive pride, and a deep, agonizing sense of misunderstood isolation, Jungkook aggressively grabbed his heavy bags and violently stormed right out of the massive company building, fiercely running directly into the heavy, freezing, aggressively violent downpour of the Seoul monsoon season, blindly determined to aggressively run away from his massive responsibilities, his overbearing, demanding hungs, and the suffocating, terrifying pressure of his entirely overwhelming public life. But as he heavily trudged through the freezing, heavily flooded streets, surrounded by the glaring, blindingly bright neon signs of a massive city that suddenly felt incredibly cold, terrifyingly massive, and deeply, profoundly alien to a young boy from Busan, the fiery, blinding anger slowly, violently dissolved, heavily replaced by an intensely terrifying, massive, and deeply agonizing wave of sheer, unadulterated panic, profoundly realizing with a deeply shattered, violently breaking heart that he had absolutely nowhere else to go, zero actual friends outside of the isolated group, and no real safe home other than the very brothers he had just violently, aggressively pushed away in his childish tantrum. In a massive, deeply desperate, and highly emotional panic, entirely soaked to the absolute bone, violently shivering from the freezing rain, and completely lost in the massive, terrifying labyrinth of the sprawling city, he frantically hailed a random taxi, but when the driver aggressively asked him exactly where he wanted to go, Jungkook just violently burst into massive, uncontrollable, incredibly heavy, and deeply heartbroken sobs, profoundly realizing the immense, devastating magnitude of his childish, fiercely arrogant mistake. In that incredibly dark, deeply terrifying, and massively isolating moment of sheer desperation, the absolute only person his heavily trembling fingers desperately dialed was the exact, identical older brother he had just violently fought with, Jimin. When Jimin finally answered the heavily ringing phone, still fiercely burning with intense, massive anger and deep disappointment, all he heard on the other end of the line was the incredibly tragic, deeply haunting, and violently shaking sound of his precious younger brother heavily sobbing in the freezing rain. And in that massive, incredibly profound, and beautifully heart-stopping moment, absolutely all of Jimin's fiery, defensive anger completely, instantly evaporated, violently replaced by a massive, deeply desperate, and fiercely protective older brother instinct. Jimin desperately, aggressively demanded to know exactly where Jungkook was, his voice intensely cracking with profound fear and worry. But Jungkook, completely blinded by his heavy tears and the terrifying, massive city lights, deeply sobbed that he had absolutely no idea where he was, leading Jimin to intensely, aggressively order him to just stay exactly where he was, completely dropping everything to violently sprint directly out into the freezing, aggressive downpour to desperately search for his lost, deeply terrified younger brother. When Jimin finally found Jungkook heavily standing in the freezing rain, violently shivering and completely emotionally shattered, he didn't angrily scold him, he didn't aggressively demand an apology, and he didn't fiercely lecture him about respect or broken rules. Instead, he instantly, aggressively pulled the completely soaked, violently sobbing teenager into a massive, fiercely tight and incredibly warm protective embrace, tightly holding him in the freezing, aggressive rain as they both openly, heavily, and vulnerably wept together in the dark, massively busy streets of Seoul.
Number 1. RM. The 2018 disbandment crisis. A leader's shattered crown. Picture this. It is the incredibly blinding, massively historic, and highly deceptive year of 2018. An era that to the outside world looked like the absolute, unquestionable pinnacle of BTS's meteoric rise to unprecedented global domination. A time when they were aggressively breaking massive Billboard records, attending highly prestigious American award shows, and intensely cementing their untouchable status as international pop music royalty. But behind the heavily guarded doors of their luxurious hotel rooms, the tinted windows of their private jets, and the fiercely bright, blinding stadium spotlights, it was actually the darkest, most terrifyingly toxic, and deeply agonizing period of their entire lives. A highly volatile time when the incredibly massive, suffocating pressure of sudden global superstardom actively fractured their fragile mental states and violently pushed the incredibly close-knit group to the absolute terrifying brink of total, permanent disbandment. Enter RM, the incredibly brilliant, deeply philosophical, and astronomically burdened leader, a remarkably young, fiercely intelligent man who had originally birthed the very foundational concept of BTS, sacrificing his entire youth, his highly respected, authentic underground hip-hop credibility, and his own personal, fragile mental health to violently drag 6 other intensely young, heavily inexperienced boys from a tiny, heavily indebted, and entirely obscure entertainment company to the absolute staggering zenith of the global music industry. You absolutely must genuinely, profoundly understand the astronomical, mind-breaking psychological weight that was aggressively crushing RM's spirit on a daily basis during this incredibly chaotic era. He wasn't just heavily responsible for writing their massive hit songs or intensely managing their complex group dynamics, he was actively forced by the massive, terrifying machinery of their skyrocketing fame to be their exclusive English translator, their heavily polished global spokesperson, and their absolutely unbreakable, completely emotionally bulletproof shield against the vicious, fiercely demanding Western media. As the relentless, bone-crushing schedule of the incredibly massive Love Yourself World Tour aggressively stripped away their last remaining ounces of human sanity, sleep, and physical energy, the desperately exhausted members began to violently turn on each other, intensely snapping over tiny, highly insignificant choreography mistakes, aggressively isolating themselves in dark, painfully quiet hotel rooms, and heavily, seriously contemplating the terrifying, completely unthinkable idea of just violently throwing their massive, blood-soaked musical empire completely away. The highly explosive, entirely relationship-altering catalyst for this massive, deeply profound group-shattering confrontation wasn't just a simple, petty disagreement over food or an incredibly silly fight over shared dorm resources. It was a massively profound, deeply existential crisis that aggressively infected every single member, transforming their once incredibly loud, warmly laughter-filled dressing rooms into terrifyingly silent, heavily suffocating war zones, deeply filled with intense, raw exhaustion, massive anxiety, and deeply bitter, unspoken resentment. RM finally completely reached his absolute terrifying breaking point during a highly volatile, intensely emotional, and deeply guarded late-night group intervention, where the incredibly taboo, massive, and highly terrifying word disbandment was actually seriously thrown directly onto the table by members who were completely mentally and physically shattered. When several profoundly exhausted, deeply traumatized members passionately, aggressively argued with heavy tears streaming down their faces that they physically and mentally could absolutely not survive another single, grueling year in this ruthless, suffocating, entirely unfeeling corporate meat grinder, RM, heavily feeling the massive, crushing weight of their impending doom and entirely terrified of losing his deeply beloved life's work, violently snapped in a blinding, explosive flash of pure, unadulterated desperation, deep emotional betrayal, and fiercely bruised leadership pride. He aggressively raised his normally calm, deeply soothing, and highly diplomatic voice to an incredibly deafening, completely heartbroken roar, fiercely screaming at his incredibly exhausted brothers that they absolutely could not just violently, selfishly abandon the massive, beautiful dream they had literally starved, bled, heavily cried, and intensely sacrificed their entire youths to aggressively build together, violently reminding them of the massive, impossible, and highly terrifying odds they had already violently conquered as a completely united front. But the intensely broken, highly defensive, and massively overwhelmed members fiercely fired right back with equal devastating intensity, aggressively demanding to know exactly why they had to blindly, obediently suffer in silent, agonizing mental torture just to constantly maintain the highly manufactured, heavily exhausting public illusion of a perfect, entirely unbreakable boy band, fiercely accusing RM of heavily prioritizing the massive, terrifying machinery of the BTS global brand entirely over their own individual, desperately fragile, and intensely suffering human lives. In that incredibly dark, profoundly suffocating, and massively terrifying moment, completely surrounded by his violently weeping, intensely broken brothers who were fiercely begging for an incredibly desperate release from their massive pain, RM's fierce defensive armor of strict, highly demanding leadership completely and violently shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces, suddenly plunging him into a massive, uncontrollable, and deeply heartbreaking emotional breakdown right there in the middle of the heavily tense room. He heavily collapsed, violently sobbing alongside them, entirely dropping the massive, exhausting, and highly fake facade of the fearless, untouchable leader, and deeply, vulnerably confessing his own intense, paralyzing terrors, fiercely admitting that he was just as incredibly lost, massively terrified, heavily depressed, and profoundly exhausted as they were, and that the astronomically heavy, profoundly lonely lonely crown of leadership was violently, actively crushing his own soul into absolute, suffocating dust. This incredibly raw, violently painful, and massively dramatic group confrontation could have incredibly easily ended their entire massive, historic career right then and there, permanently dissolving the absolute biggest band in the entire world into a massive, tragic historical footnote of burnout and bitter resentment. But this terrifyingly dark, intensely tear-soaked collision of intensely broken souls miraculously became the absolute, undeniable, beautifully profound salvation of their entire brotherhood. By completely stripping away the highly toxic, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous expectations of relentless global perfection, and heavily confronting their absolute darkest, most terrifying internal demons together on that freezing, emotionally devastated night, RM fundamentally, profoundly, and permanently shifted his entire psychological approach to leadership, beautifully realizing that true, profound leadership isn't about ruthlessly, aggressively forcing your intensely broken team to blindly march forward into the brutal, deadly fire of ambition, but about having the sheer, breathtaking, and immense courage to gently command them to completely stop, fiercely drop their heavy, burdensome weapons, and openly, beautifully bleed together until the massive, gaping emotional wounds finally begin to heal. This violently painful, highly traumatic, yet completely beautiful and deeply necessary internal war aggressively birthed the profoundly heartbreaking, fiercely authentic, and highly legendary album Tear, channeling all of their massive rage, intense sorrow, and beautiful vulnerability directly into their incredible music, and it ultimately culminated in their incredibly legendary, massively emotional 2018 Mama acceptance speech.